Alrighty, everybody, we are so freaking back for some Hegelians of the Storm Part 6. Let's go. It is a flash flood warning, so time to put up a slippery when wet sign, because it is torrential downpour over here. What that means is that it is the perfect day to be reading some Hegel and playing some ARAM. So we are going to start out. Quick change of plans, folks. We're going right into the reading. Freedom of self-consciousness, stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. For the independent self-consciousness, on the one hand, its essence is only the pure abstraction of the I. And on the other hand, when this abstraction develops and acquires differences, this differentiation does not become an objective essence that is in itself. So this self-consciousness does not become an I that in its simplicity is genuinely self-differentiating, or that in this absolute differentiation remains identical with itself. By contrast, the consciousness that is driven back into itself becomes, in the act of forming, its own object as the form of the thing it has cultivated. And in the Lord, oh wait, no, that's right. Okay, so we're not talking God per se, but we are talking about that Lord consciousness and then the bondsman consciousness. And in the Lord, it intuits at the same time being for itself as consciousness. But for the subservient consciousness as such, these two moments, that of itself as independent object, and that of this object as a consciousness, and hence its own essence, fall apart. Since, however, the form and the being for itself are for us, or in themselves, the same, and since in the conception of the independent consciousness, the being in itself is consciousness, the side of being in itself, or thinghood, which received the form in the labor, is no other substance than consciousness. And a new shape of self-consciousness has arisen for us, a consciousness which, as the infinitude or the pure movement of consciousness, is aware of itself as the essence, a consciousness that thinks or is free self-consciousness. For to think means to be one's own object, not as abstract I, but as an I that has at the same time the significance of being in itself, of having itself for object, or of relating itself to the objective essence in such a way that it has the significance of the being for itself of the consciousness for which it is. For thinking, the object does not move in representations or shapes, but in concepts, i.e., in a distant being in itself, which immediately for consciousness is not at all distinct from it. What is represented, shaped, a being, has, as such, the form of being something other than consciousness, but a concept is, at the same time, a being, and this difference, insofar as it is the concept itself, is its determinate content. But since this content is at the same time a content conceptualized, consciousness remains immediately conscious of its unity with this determinate and differentiated being. Not, as in case of representation, where consciousness still has specifically to remind itself that this is its representation, whereas the concept is for me immediately my concept. In thinking, I am free, because I am not in another, but remain simply together with myself, and the object, which is for me the essence, is in undivided unity my being for myself, and my movement in concepts is a movement within myself. But in this determination of this shape of self-consciousness, it is essential to keep in mind that this shape is thinking consciousness in general, or its object is immediate unity of being in itself and being for itself. The conscious, I don't exactly know what that word is. I'm doing the thing. Homonymous, having the same name, of the nature of a homonym. homonymous, homonymous with itself, that repels itself from itself, becomes to itself an element that is in itself. But at first it is to itself this element only as universal essence in general, not as this objective essence in the development and movement of its manifold being. This freedom of self-consciousness, when it emerged as its conscious appearance in the history of spirit, was, as we know, called Stoicism. Oh no! Come on, man. You can't be telling me that the root of philosophy is Stoicism. Oh. Not to dissuade you from being somebody who subscribes to the philosophy of Stoicism. I just think that if you make Stoicism to be your entire identity without adding on to it in any way, shape, or form, then I'm going to react to you like this. Oh, come on, man. Its principle is that consciousness is thinking essence, and that something has essentiality for consciousness, or is true and good for it, only as consciousness comports itself therein. Alright, we're going to pause. We're going to look up comports, because I feel like I've only read that word once. And never feel bad for looking up a word. Third person singular simple present indicative of a form of comport. Okay, what's a comport? I'm going to have to look up that word too. Intransitive verb, to conduct or behave oneself in a particular manner. Comport yourself with dignity. Alright, we can tell that this was written in 1850. Only as consciousness comports itself therein as thinking essence. So as long as consciousness behaves itself therein as thinking essence. The manifold expansion of life, differentiating itself within itself, the singularization and complication of life, is the object on which desire and labor are active. This manifold doing has now contracted into the simple differentiating, which occurs in the pure movement of thinking. What has more essentiality is not the difference that presents itself as a determinate thing, or as consciousness of a determinate natural being there, as a feeling, or as a desire and purpose for this desire, whether this purpose is set by one's own consciousness or by an alien consciousness. But the only difference is that is a thought difference, or is immediately not distinct from me. This consciousness is consequently negative toward the relationship of lordship and bondage. Its doing is, in lordship, not to have its truth in the bondsman, nor, as bondsman, to have its truth in the will of the Lord and in his service, but to be free, whether on the throne or in chains, in all the dependency of its singular being there, and to maintain for itself the lifelessness that constantly withdraws from the movement of being there, from activity as well as from suffering, into the simple essentiality of thought. Self-will is the freedom that fastens onto a singularity and stands within bondage, while Stoicism is the freedom that always comes immediately out of bondage and back into the pure universality of thought. We're giving Stoicism quite a bit of credit right now. As universal form of the world spirit. So, man. As universal form of the world spirit, Stoicism could only emerge in a time of universal fear and bondage, but also in the time of a universal culture that has elevated cultivation up to thinking. Now it is true for this self-consciousness, the essence is neither another than itself, nor the pure abstraction of the I. The essence is I, which has otherness in it, but as a difference in thought, so that in its otherness the I has immediately returned into itself. Yet at the same time this essence of self-consciousness is only an abstract essence. The freedom of self-consciousness is indifferent to the natural being there, has therefore likewise let this being there go free, and the reflection is a double reflection. Freedom in thought has only pure thought as its truth, a truth without the fullness of life, and so it is also only the concept of freedom, not living freedom itself, for the essence of that freedom is at first only thinking in general, the form as such which has turned away from the independence of things and returned into itself. But since the singularity as acting should present itself as the full of life, or as thinking should grasp the living world in a system of thought, there would have to reside in thought itself a content. For the expansion of action, a content of what is good, for the expansion of thinking, a content of what is true, in order that in what is for consciousness, there should be no other ingredient whatsoever except the concept which is the essence. But here, the concept as abstraction cuts itself off from the multiplicity of things, and so it has no content in itself, but a content given to it. Consciousness does indeed eliminate the content as an alien being when it thinks it, but the concept is a determinate concept, and this determinancy of the concept is the alien element that it has in it. Stoicism, therefore, got into difficulties when it was asked, as they expressed it, for the criterion of truth. I do know what criterion means. That means like the criteria of, which just means a list including attributes related to criteria. Criteria means a bunch of stuff, a bunch of required stuff of truth in general, i.e., strictly speaking, for a content of thought itself. To the question put to it, what is good and true, it again gave in answer the countless thinking, contentless thinking itself. The true and the good shall consist in rationality, but this equality of thinking with itself is again only the pure form in which nothing is determined. The true and the good, wisdom and virtue, the universal words at which Stoicism has come to a standstill, are therefore no doubt uplifting in general, but since they cannot in fact come to any expansion of the content, they soon begin to generate boredom. Heyo! This thinking consciousness, in the way in which it has determined itself as an abstract freedom, is thus only the incomplete negation of otherness. Withdrawn from the being there only into itself, it has not accomplished itself as an absolute negation of the being there in it. The content, it is true, for it counts only as thought, but also as determinate thought, and at the same time as determinancy as such. Skepticism is the realization of that which Stoicism is only the concept, and the actual experience of what freedom of thought is. This freedom is in itself the negative, and must display itself as such. With the reflection of self-consciousness into the simple thought of itself, the independent being there, or the permanent determinancy, has a vis-a-vis. That reflection, in fact, fallen outside of the infinitude of thought. In skepticism, the entire inessentiality and dependence of this other now comes before consciousness. Thought becomes the complete thinking that annihilates the being of the multiplied determined world, and the negativity of free self-consciousness becomes for itself real negativity in this manifold configuration of life. Tea break, because I don't have a glass of water right next to me. Delicious. It tastes like English breakfast tea with oat milk and the smallest amount of honey in it, meaning that I can't taste the honey at all. It is clear that just as Stoicism corresponds to the concept of the independent consciousness, which appeared as the relationship of mastery and bondage, so skepticism corresponds to the realization of this concept as the negative attitude towards otherness as desire and labor. But if desire and labor were unable to affect the negation for self-consciousness, this polemical, I know how to pronounce that one, don't know what it means, so we're gonna look it up. Adjective, polemic, controversial, disputatious, similar, polemic, okay? A controversial argument, especially one refuting or attacking a specific opinion or doctrine. Person engaged in or inclined to controversy, argument, or refutation. Oh, myself. That's funny. Okay, this polemical, meaning controversial, aggressive, or maybe not aggressive, but like controversial and at odds attitude towards the multiple independence of things will, by contrast, meet with success because it turns against them as free will, as free self-consciousness that is already complete within itself. More specifically, because this attitude has within its own self thinking or infinitude, and in this the independencies of in their indifference are for it only vanishing magnitudes, the differences which in the pure thinking of itself are only the abstraction of differences. Here become all the differences, and all differentiated being becomes a difference of self-consciousness. In this way, what skepticism does in general, and the manner in which it does it, has determined itself. Skepticism exhibits the dialectical movement, oh, there it is, which sensory certainty, perception, and the understanding are. It also exhibits the unessentiality of what counts, in the relationship of lordship and service, and what counts for abstract thinking itself, as something determinate. This relationship, at the same time, comprises within itself a determinate mode in which ethical laws, too, are present as commands of mastery, but the determinations in abstract thinking are concepts of science into which contentless thinking spreads itself, attaching the concept in a way that is in fact merely external to the being that is independent for it and constitutes its content, and regards as valid only determinate concepts, even though they are also pure abstractions. The dialectical, as negative movement in the way it immediately is, initially appears to consciousness as something to which it is surrendered, and which is not engendered by consciousness itself. As skepticism, on the other hand, this movement, is a moment of self-consciousness, to which it does not happen that what is for it the true and the real vanish without its knowing how, but which, in the certainty of its freedom, itself makes this other ostensible reality vanish. Self-consciousness causes to vanish not only the objective as such, but its own attitude to it, in which it counts as objective and is made valid. Hence, too, its perceiving is made to vanish, along with its reinforcement of what is in danger of losing. Sophistry and the truth it has determined and established from its own resources. Through this self-consciousness negation, self-consciousness procures for itself the certainty of its freedom, produces the experience of that certitude, and thereby elevates it to truth. What vanishes is the determinate, or the difference which, in whatever way and whatever its source, establishes itself as fixed and immutable. This difference has nothing permanent in it and must vanish for thinking, because the different is just this, not to be self-contained, but to have its essentiality only in another. But thinking is the insight into this nature of the different. It is the negative essence as simple. In the variability of all that would stabilize itself before it, the skeptical self-consciousness thus experiences its own freedom as given to it by itself, and preserved by itself. It is for itself this ataraxia? Oh man. Today is definition day, and I gotta make sure that we know that. Ataraxia. That sounds like a fictional thing. Oh no, it's Greek philosophy. Oh, it's the same. It is a fictional thing. A perfect peace of mind or calmness. I would think that a word to describe perfect stillness of mind would not be ataraxia. Although it is kind of soothing to say now that I'm saying it out loud. Ataraxia. In ancient Greek philosophy, ataraxia, generally translated to as unperturbedness, imperturbability, equanimity, or tranquility, is a lucid state of robust equanimity characterized by ongoing freedom from distress and worry. Huh. Top 10 things I'll never be. Okay, it is for itself this ataraxia of thinking that thinks itself, the unchanging and the genuine certainty of itself. This certainty does not issue from something alien, compressing its complex development within itself, as a result which would leave its coming to be behind it. No, consciousness itself is the absolute dialectical unrest. This melange of sensory and thought representations whose differences coincide, and whose equality likewise dissolves in turn. For equality is itself the determinancy in contrast to the unequal. But it is precisely here that this consciousness, instead of being consciousness equal to itself, is in fact just an utterly contingent confusion, the vertigo of a perpetually self-engendering disorder. That's a pretty good description of consciousness. It is for itself. It is this for itself, for consciousness itself maintains and produces this confusion in motion. That is why it also confesses to it. It confesses to being a wholly contingent, singular consciousness, a consciousness which is empirical, takes its guidance from what has no reality for it, obeys what is for it no essence, does and brings to actuality what has no truth for it. But equally, while it evaluates itself in this way as singular, contingent, and in fact animal life, and lost self-consciousness, it also, on the contrary, makes itself again into a consciousness that is universal and equal to itself, for it is the negativity of all singularity, and all difference. From this equality to itself, or rather within this equality to itself, it falls back again into this contingency and confusion, for this self-moving negativity has to do solely with what is singular, and gallivants with the contingent. This consciousness is therefore the unconscious, rambling, passing back and forth from the extreme of self-consciousness equal to itself, to the extreme of the contingent consciousness that is confused and confusing. It does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. At one time it recognizes its freedom as elevation above all the confusion and all the contingency of being there, and at another time likewise confesses to a relapse into inessentiality and to gallivanting. Yeah, that is gallivanting. I thought that said galvanizing for a second. And to gallivanting in it. It lets the unessential content in its thinking vanish, but in this very act it is the consciousness of something unessential. It pronounces absolute vanishing, but the pronouncement is, and this consciousness is the vanishing pronounced. It pronounces the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc. etc. And it itself sees, hears, etc. It pronounces the nullity of ethical essentialities and makes these same essentialities of power. It makes these same essentialities the power of its action. Its doings and its words always contradict each other, and likewise it itself has the double contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and equality, and of utter contingency and inequality with itself. But it keeps the poles of this contradiction of itself apart, and adopts the same attitude to it as it does in its purely negative movement in general. Point out equality to it, and it points out inequality. When it is now confronted with the inequality that it has just pronounced, it switches to pointing out equality. Its chatter is in fact a squabble of self-willed children, one of whom says A if the other says B, and in turn says B if the other says A, and who by contradicting themselves purchase the pleasure of remaining in contradiction with each other. Yeah, I mean that feels accurate. You know, I like if something good happens to you, you think of something bad. If something bad happens to you, you kind of wish that it was something good instead. But how do we control that bundle of squabbling children in our brains? Hegel, we need the answers, and we need the answers maybe 50 years ago. In skepticism, consciousness experiences itself in truth as a consciousness contradictory within itself. From this experience emerges a new shape, which destiny, the final shape, which brings together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. Skepticism's thoughtlessness about itself must vanish, because it is in fact one consciousness which has these two modes in it. This new shape is thereby one for which itself, one which is for itself the double consciousness of itself, as self-liberating, unchangeable, and equal to itself, and of itself as a self-confusing, self-inverting, and the consciousness of this is its contradiction. In Stoicism, self-consciousness is simply freedom of itself. In skepticism, this freedom realizes itself, annihilates the other side of determinate being there, but more exactly duplicates itself, and is now to itself something twofold. In this way, the duplication which earlier was divided between two singletons, the lord and the bondsman, has now settled. Oh God, where was I? Duplicating itself, has now settled in one. With this, the duplication of self-consciousness within itself, which is essential in the concept of spirit, is present, but not yet its unity, and the unhappy consciousness, probably where most of us sit, is the consciousness of itself as the double, merely contradictory essence. This unhappy internal split consciousness, since the contradiction of its essence is to itself one consciousness, must always have in the one consciousness the other consciousness too, and so it must immediately be driven out of each of them again, as soon as it thinks that it has arrived at victory and the repose of unity. But its true return into itself, or its reconciliation with itself, will display the concept of spirit, the spirit that has become alive and entered into existence, because this is already in it, that as one undivided consciousness. It is a duplicated consciousness. It itself is the gazing of one self-consciousness into another, and it itself is both, and the unity of both is also to it the essence, but for itself it is not yet this essence itself, not yet the unity of the two self-consciousnesses that are both inside of you, and they are both kissing. Since it is initially only the immediate unity of the two, but for it the two are not the same, but opposed. One of them, namely the simple unchangeable, is to it as the essence, but the other, the multiple changeable, is as the unessential. The two are, for it, essences that are alien to one another, and because of it, it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction. It ranges itself on the other side of the unchangeable consciousness, and is to itself the unessential. But as consciousness of unchangeableness, or the simple essence, it must at the same time set about freeing itself from the unessential, i.e., freeing itself from itself. For though it is for itself only the changeable, and the unchangeable is for it something alien, yet it is itself simple, and hence unchangeable, consciousness, a consciousness of which is thus conscious at its essence, but in such a way that for itself again it itself is not the essence, this essence. The position it assigns to the two cannot therefore be an indifference of them towards each other, i.e., not an indifference of itself towards the unchangeable. Rather, it is itself immediately both of them, and the relation of the two is for it as a relation of the essence to the non-essence, so that this latter is to be sublated. But since for it both are equally essential and contradictory, it is merely the contradictory movement in which the contrary does not come to rest in its contrary, but within it only generates itself anew as a contrary. So, again, just briefly, my takeaway is that this is a constant frustration of existence, and I feel it. Here then we have a struggle against an enemy, victory over whom is rather a defeat, where attainment of the other one is rather the loss of it in its contrary. Consciousness of life, of its being there and activity, is only grief over this being there and activity, for it has in this only the consciousness of its contrary as the essence, and of its own nothingness. It passes over out of this it passes over out of this into an ascent to the unchangeable, but this ascent is itself this consciousness, so the ascent is the consciousness of the contrary, namely of itself as singularity. The unchangeable that enters into consciousness is by this very fact at the same time affected by singularity, and is only present with the latter, far from having destroyed singularity in the consciousness of the unchangeable singularity. Destroyed singularity in the consciousness of the unchangeable, singularity only emerges constantly in it. But in this movement, consciousness experiences just this emergence of singularity in the unchangeable, and of the unchangeable in singularity. There comes to be for consciousness singularity in general in the unchangeable essence, and at the same time its own singularity in it. For the truth of this movement is just the oneness of this double consciousness. This unity becomes for it, but it is initially a unity in which the diversity of the two is still the dominant feature. Thus, there is present for consciousness the threefold way in which singularity is linked with the unchangeable. First, consciousness again emerges for itself as opposed to the unchangeable, and it is thrown back to the beginning of the struggle which remains in the element of the whole relationship. But secondly, the unchangeable itself has singularity in it for consciousness, so that singularity is the shape of the unchangeable, and with this, the entire mode of existence passes over into the unchangeable. Thirdly, consciousness finds its own self as the singular in the unchangeable. The first unchangeable is to consciousness only the alien essence, condemning singularity, since the second unchangeable is a shape of singularity as consciousness itself is consciousness. Thirdly comes to be spirit. It has the joy of finding itself in it and becomes conscious that its singularity is reconciled with the universal. I think that that's a point. As I'm reading this, I'm getting pictures in my head of my brain trying to understand what this is, and I'm getting images of like a tesseract and of the yin and yang, being these things within things that are the same things. A constantly unfolding fourth dimensional object such as the tesseract is its walls and its mass and its interior and is its exterior. There is no part of it that is not it as it presents itself to be. And same with the yin and yang. I actually saw a visualization. I was just doom scrolling on Instagram, and I see this post that is like, they don't, it's the guy over in the corner, and he's like, they don't realize that the points on the, well, now I have to find the meme and put it on the YouTube video. But they don't realize that the point of the white and the black and the black and the white of the yin and yang symbol, they're two ends of the same wormhole that make up one thing. And I think that that's kind of what it feels like that is what Hegel is talking about here, with my lack of a doctorate in philosophy. I think I can confidently say that. What presents itself here as mode and relationship of the unchangeable arose as the experience which the divided self-consciousness undergoes in its unhappiness. Now this experience is, of course, not its own one-sided movement, for this self-consciousness is itself unchangeable consciousness. Accordingly, the latter is at the same time singular consciousness too, and the movement is just as much a movement of the unchangeable consciousness, which takes part in the movement as much as the other. For the movement runs through these moments. First, the unchangeable is opposed to the singular in general, then itself singular is opposed to the other singular, and finally, it is one with this singular. But this consideration, insofar as it belongs to us, is here untimely, for what has arisen for us up to now is only unchangeableness as unchangeableness of consciousness, which is therefore not true unchangeableness, but still burdened with an opposition. Not the unchangeable in and for itself we do not know, therefore how the latter will behave. What has emerged here is only this, that to consciousness, which is our object here, the determinations indicated appear in the unchangeable. For this reason, therefore, the unchangeable consciousness also retains in its very shaping the character and foundation of dividedness, and being for itself with regard to the singular consciousness. Consequently, for the latter, the unchangeable's acquisition of this shape of singularity is altogether a happening, just as it also merely finds itself opposed to it and thus has this relationship by nature, that finally it does find itself in the unchangeable, appears to it to be brought about partly, no doubt, by itself, or to take place because it is itself singular. But a part of this unity, both as regards its origin and insofar as it is, appears as belonging to the unchangeable, and the opposition persists within this unity itself. In fact, through the shaping of the unchangeable, the moment of the beyond has not only remained, but is rather still established, for if the beyond seems, on the one hand, to have been brought closer to consciousness through the shape of singular actuality, on the other hand, from now it confronts it as an opaque sensory one, with all the rigidity of something actual. The hope of becoming one with it must remain a hope, i.e., without fulfillment and presence, for between the hope and the fulfillment stands precisely the absolute contingency or immobile difference which lies in the shaping itself, and the shaping that grounds the hope. Through the nature of this one that simply is, through the actuality that it has assumed, it necessarily happens that it has vanished in time, and that it has been in space and far away, and remains utterly far away. If at first the mere concept of the divided consciousness determined itself to set about sublating itself as a singular and becoming the unchangeable consciousness, from now on its endeavor has this determination, rather to sublate its relationship to the pure unshaped unchangeable, and to acquire a relation only with the shaped unchangeable. For the oneness of the singular with the unchangeable is henceforth essence and object for consciousness, just as in the concept of the shapeless abstract unchangeable was the essential object, and the relationship of this absolute dividedness of the concept is now what it has to turn away from. But as for the initially external relation to the shape unchangeable as an alien actuality, it has to elevate this to absolute unification. Ooh. The movement in which the unessential consciousness strives to attain this oneness is itself the threefold movement corresponding to the threefold relationship that this consciousness will have with its shaped beyond. First, as pure consciousness. Secondly, as singular essence that comports itself towards actuality as desire and work. And thirdly, as consciousness of its being for itself. Tea break. My throat's like, hey, you haven't done this in a week. And I'm like, yeah, I haven't. Big sippy. How these three modes of its being are present and determined in that universal relationship. First, then, when consciousness is considered as pure consciousness, the shaped unchangeable, when he is for the pure consciousness, seems to be posited as he is in and for himself. But how he is in and for himself, this, as we have already mentioned, has not yet arisen. For him to be in consciousness as he is in and for himself, this would certainly have to proceed from him rather than from the consciousness, but his presence here is thus at first only one-sidedly at hand through consciousness, and for that very reason not perfect and genuine, but remains burdened with imperfection or an opposition, just like real life. But although the unhappy consciousness therefore does not possess this presence, it is at the same time beyond pure thinking insofar as this is the abstract thinking of Stoicism, which averts its eyes from singularity altogether, and the merely agitated thinking of skepticism, which is in fact only singularity as unconscious contradiction and restless movement. It is beyond both of these. It brings and keeps together pure thinking and singularity, but has not yet risen to that thinking for which the singularity of consciousness is reconciled with pure thinking itself. For, goodness, it stands rather in the middle, where abstract thinking comes into contact with the singularity of consciousness as singularity. Consciousness itself is this contract. It is the unity of pure thinking and singularity. This is also for consciousness, this thinking singularity or pure thinking, and the unchangeable itself essentially as singularity. But what is not for it is that this, its object, the unchangeable, which essentially presents itself to it in the shape of singularity, is consciousness itself, which is singularity of consciousness. In the first mode, therefore, where we consider it as pure consciousness, it does not comport itself to its object thinkingly, but since it is indeed in itself pure thinking singularity, and its object is just this pure thinking, through the relation of one to the other, it is not itself pure thinking. It only goes, so to speak, towards thinking, and is devotion. That's me when I'm trying to read a book, because I'm like, yeah, I'm thinking about reading it, because I'm thinking about reading it so much, it's almost like I'm reading it. That's how I approach Hegel. As such, its thinking remains the amorphous peal of bell ringing, or a warm cloud of mist, a musical thinking that does not get as far as the concept, which would be the only immanent objective mode. This infinite pure inner feeling will indeed find its object, but the object will make its entrance not as a conceptualized object, and will therefore enter as something alien. What we have here, therefore, is the inward movement of the pure heart, which feels itself, but feels itself painfully as division, the movement of an infinite yearning, whoa, okay, Hegel, that has the certainty that its essence is such a pure heart, pure thinking that thinks itself as a singularity. Certainty that it is known and recognized by this object precisely because the object thinks itself as singularity. At the same time, however, this essence is the unattainable beyond which flees as we grasp it, or rather has already fled. It has already flown, for it is on the one hand the unchangeable that thinks itself as singularity, and consciousness therefore immediately attains its own self in it, its own self, but as the consciousness opposed to the unchangeable, instead of grasping the essence, it only feels it, and it has fallen back into itself, since in the attainment it cannot keep itself as this opposed consciousness at bay. It has, instead of grasping the essence, only grasped the inessentiality. Oh man, so like as soon as we get it, we don't. Because of the way that our self-consciousness creates duplicates of itself. Just as on one side, in striving to attain itself in the essence, it grasps its own separated actuality, so on the other side it cannot grasp the other as a singular, or as actual. Where the other is sought, it cannot be found, for it is supposed to be precisely a beyond, the sort of thing that cannot be found. When sought as a singular, it is not a universal singularity in thought, not a concept, but a singular as an object, or something actual, an object of immediate sensory certainty, and for that very reason, only the sort of thing that has vanished. For consciousness, therefore, only the grave of its life can come to presence. Whoa. But because this grave is itself an actuality, and it goes against the nature of actuality to grant a lasting possession, this presence of the grave, too, is merely the struggle of an endeavor that is bound to be lost. By having learned from experience that the grave of its actual unchangeable essence has no actuality, that the vanished singularity, as vanished, is not the true singularity, Consciousness will give up looking for the unchangeable singularity as actual, or holding on to it as vanished, and only in this way it is able to find singularity as genuine or as universal. But initially the return of the heart into its own self is to be taken to signify that it has actuality as a singular. It is the pure heart which for us or in itself has found itself and is satiated within itself, for although for it in its feeling the essence separates itself from it, yet in itself this feeling is self-feeling. It has felt the object of its pure feeling, and this object is itself. From this it thus emerges as self-feeling, or as something that is actual for itself. In this return into itself, its second relationship has emerged for us, the relationship of desire and work. I don't desire work, which confirm for consciousness the inner certainty of itself, which it has attained for us, by sublation and enjoyment of the alien essence, namely the essence in the form of independent things. But the unhappy consciousness finds itself only as desiring and working. It is not on hand for consciousness that the inner certainty of itself lies at the basis of its finding itself thus, and that its feeling of the essence is this self-feeling. Since it does not have this certainty for its own self, its interior rather still remains the broken certainty of itself, and the confirmation that would obtain through work and enjoyment is therefore just such a broken confirmation. Okay, that I relate to a lot more. Or rather, it must for itself nullify this confirmation so that it does find confirmation in it, but only confirmation of what it is for itself, namely confirmation of its dividedness. I think we're going to do one more, then we're going to jump back into another game. The actuality against which desire and work are directed is no longer for this consciousness a nullity in itself, something merely to be sublated and consumed by it, but something like that consciousness itself, an actuality broken in two, which is only on one side null in itself, but on the other side is also a sanctified world. It is a shape of the unchangeable, for this has received in itself singularity, and because, as the unchangeable, it is a universal, the singularity has, in general, the significance of all actuality. Okay, I lied, we're doing one more. If consciousness were for itself independent consciousness, and actuality were to it null in and for itself, then, in the labor and in the enjoyment, it would attain the feeling of its independence, in virtue of the fact that it would be consciousness itself that sublated actuality. But since this actuality is to consciousness a shape of the unchangeable, it is unable of itself to sublate it. But when it does succeed in nullifying actuality and enjoying it, this essentially happens for consciousness in virtue of the fact that the unchangeable itself surrenders its shape and hands it over to consciousness for enjoyment. Tea break. Another slurp. Another big sippy. Consciousness, for its part, likewise emerges here as something actual, but equally as internally broken, and in its labor and enjoyment this dividedness displays itself as breaking up, into a relationship, to actuality or being for itself, and a being in itself. This relationship to actuality is altering, or activity, the being for itself that belongs to the singular consciousness as such, but in this, consciousness is also in itself. This side belongs to the unchangeable beyond. It is the faculties and forces, an alien gift, which the unchangeable also hands over to consciousness for it to use. The actuality against which desire and work are directed is no longer for this consciousness a nullity in itself, something merely to be sublated and consumed by it, but something like that consciousness itself, an actuality broken in two, which is only on one side null in itself, but on the other side is also a sanctified world. It is a shape of the unchangeable, for this has received in itself singularity. And because, as the unchangeable, it is a universal, its singularity has in general the significance of all actuality. If consciousness were for itself independent consciousness, and actuality were to it null in and for itself, then in the labor and in the enjoyment it would attain to the feeling of its independence, in virtue of the fact that it would be consciousness itself that sublated actuality. But since this actuality is to consciousness a shape of the unchangeable, it is unable of itself to sublate it. When it does succeed in nullifying actuality and enjoying it, this essentially happens for consciousness in virtue of the fact that the unchangeable itself surrenders its shape, and hands it over to consciousness for enjoyment. Consciousness, for its part, likewise emerges here as something actual, but equally as internally broken, and in its labor and enjoyment, this dividedness displays itself as a breaking up into a relationship to actuality or being for itself, and a being in itself. This relationship to actuality is altering or activity, the being for itself that belongs to the singular consciousness. Did I already read this? Did I already read this, or is this just a repeat of what he's saying? The great debate. This relationship to actuality is altering your activity, but in this, consciousness is also in itself. This side belongs to the unchangeable beyond. It is the faculties and forces an alien gift, which the unchangeable also hands over to consciousness for it to use. Accordingly, in its activity, consciousness is initially in the relationship of two extremes. On one side, it stands as active worldliness, and confronting it is passive actuality. The two sides are in relation with one another, but both have also drawn into the unchangeable and keep to themselves. From each side, therefore, only a surface detaches itself in response to the other, and this enters the play of movement with regard to the other. The extreme of actuality is sublated by the active extreme, but actuality on its side can be sublated only for the reason that it is unchangeable essence, sublates it itself, repels itself from itself, and hands over what is repelled to the activity. The active force appears as the power, in which actuality is dissolved, but because of this, for this consciousness, to which the in itself, or the essence, is something other than itself, this power, in the form of which it enters the lists in its activity, is beyond of consciousness itself. So, instead of returning from its activity back into itself and having proved itself for its own self, consciousness rather reflects this movement of activity back into the other extreme, which is thereby displayed as a pure universal, as the absolute power from which the movement proceeded in all directions, and which is the essence both of the self-disintegrating extremes as they first emerged, and of the exchange itself. By the fact that the unchangeable consciousness renounces its shape and surrenders it, by the fact that contrasts the singular consciousness, gives thanks, i.e., denies itself the satisfaction of the consciousness of its independence, and assigns the essence of the activity not to itself but to the beyond. Pausing here for a quick moment while I fix the audio, so that way we can get some of that wonderful looping music in the background. Blah 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 blah, and assigns the essence of the activity not to itself but to the beyond. By these two moments of reciprocal self-renunciation of both parties, there certainly arises for consciousness its unity with the unchangeable, but this unity is at the same time affected with separation, is again broken within itself, and from the opposition of the universal and singular emerges again. For consciousness does make a show of renouncing the satisfaction of its self-feeling, but it obtains the actual satisfaction of it, for it has been desire, work, and enjoyment. As consciousness, it has willed, acted, and enjoyed. Likewise, its thanksgiving, in which it recognizes the other extreme as the essence and sublates itself, is itself its own activity, which counterbalances the activity of the other extreme, and opposes an equal activity to the self-sacrificing benefaction. If the other extreme delivers over to consciousness its surface, consciousness gives thanks all the same, and in surrendering its activity, i.e., its essence, it really does more than the other. which only discards a surface from itself. Thus, not only the actual desiring, working, and enjoying, but even in the thanksgiving itself, where the contrary seems to happen, the entire movement is reflected into the extreme of singularity. Consciousness feels itself therein as the singular consciousness, and does not let itself be deceived by the semblance of its reunification. No, sorry, its renunciation. For the truth of this consciousness is that it has not surrendered itself. What has come about is only the double reflection into the two extremes, and the result is the renewed splitting into the opposed consciousness of the unchangeable and the consciousness of the willing, accomplishing, and enjoying confronting it, and of the self-renunciation itself, or, in general, of the singularity that is for itself. Quick sneeze break. I'm going to actually mute for this one. Sorry, you're going to have to subscribe to my Patreon to hear my sneezes. I don't have a Patreon. This has introduced the third relationship of the movement of this consciousness, a relationship which proceeds from the second as a consciousness that has, in truth, proved itself as an independent by its willing and accomplishing. In the first relationship, it was only concept of actual consciousness, or the inner heart that is not yet actual in its doing and enjoyment. The second is this actualization as external, doing and enjoying. But on its return from this, it is the sort of consciousness that has experienced itself as actual and activating consciousness, or for which it is true to be in and for itself. But in this, the enemy is now discovered in his ownmost shape. In the struggle of the heart of the singular consciousness is only as musical, abstract moment. In work and enjoyment as the realization of this essence-bereft being, consciousness can, that's what they used to call me in high school, can immediately forget itself, and the conscious stake in this actuality is cancelled out by the thankful recognition. But this cancellation is in truth a return of consciousness into itself, and into itself as the actuality that is genuine for it. This third relationship, in which this genuine actuality is one of the extremes, is the relation of that actuality as nullity to the universal essence, and the movement of this relation is still to be considered. Concerning first the opposed relation of consciousness, where its reality is to it immediately the null, its actual doing thus becomes a doing of nothing. Its enjoyment, a feeling of its unhappiness, activity, and enjoyment thereby lose all universal content and significance, and this would give them a being in itself and being for itself, and both withdraw into singularity on which consciousness is directed in order to sublate it. Consciousness is conscious of itself as this actual singleton, also what they used to call me in high school, in the animal functions. These functions are no longer performed ingenuously. Let's look it up. Ingenuously. I think ingenuously means without genuineness. Ingenuously. Look at me, I can't spell. Lacking in cunning, guile, or worldliness, innocent, or naive. Oh, that's me. These functions are no longer performed ingenuously as something that is null in and for itself, and which cannot acquire any importance or essentiality for the spirit. Instead, since it is in them that the enemy reveals himself in his characteristic shape, they are rather the object of serious endeavor, and come precisely to be of supreme importance. This enemy, however, generates himself in his defeat, and consciousness, in fixing its attention on him, far from freeing himself from it, rather always dwells on him, and always sees itself as defiled. And since at the same time this content of its efforts, instead of being something essential, is the most base, instead of being a universal, is the most singular, we see only a personality confined to its own self and its petty doings, a personality afflicting itself as unhappy as it is impoverished. Dang. Just like me, for real. But To these two, the feeling of its unhappiness and the poverty of its activity is linked also to the consciousness of its unity with the unchangeable, for the attempted immediate annihilation of its actual being is mediated by the thought of the unchangeable, and happens in this relation. The mediate relation constitutes the essence of the negative movement in which consciousness is directed against its singularity, but which, as a relation, is in itself positive as well and will produce this its unity for consciousness itself. This mediate relation is thus a syllogism, in which singularity, initially fixing itself in opposition to the in itself, is joined together with this other extreme only through a third term. Through this middle term, the extreme of the unchangeable is for the unessential consciousness, which at the same time also involves this. It is likewise for the unchangeable consciousness only through this middle term, and thus this middle term is one which represents the two extremes to one another, and is the reciprocal minister of each one with the other. This middle term is itself a conscious essence, for it is an activity mediating consciousness as such. The content of this activity is the extinction that consciousness undertakes with its singularity. In the middle term, consciousness frees itself from activity and enjoyment as its own, and throws off the essence of its will from itself as an extreme that is for itself, and casts upon the middle term or minister the ownership and freedom of the decision, and herewith the guilt of its activity. This mediator, being in immediate relation with the unchangeable essence, ministers with its own advice on what is right. The action, since it is compliance with an alien resolution, ceases, as regards to the doing or the willing, to be its own. But there is still left to the unessential consciousness the objective aspect vis-a-vis the fruit of its labor. Hey, we know what that word means. And the enjoyment. This too is likewise cast off from itself, and just as it renounces its will, so it renounces the actuality it received in work and enjoyment. It renounces them partly as the attained truth of its self-conscious independence, when it sets about representing and speaking something entirely alien, something that makes no sense to it. It renounces them partly as external property. When it foregoes part of the possession that it has acquired through work, it partly renounces the enjoyment it has had, when in fasting and mortifications it once more completely denies itself enjoyment as well. If only there was some people that read that sentence and said, maybe that can actually be applied to the material conditions of people's labor in real life. And maybe their names were Carl Anthony Marx, I'm making up the middle name, and Frederick Anthony Engels. Thank you to all of the Anthonys out there for establishing communism. Through these moments of relinquishment of its own decision, then of property and enjoyment, and finally through the positive moment of engaging in an enterprise it does not understand, work in general, it deprives itself in truth and completely of the conscious of inner and outer freedom, of actuality as its being for itself. It has the certainty of having in truth estranged its I, and of having made its immediate self-consciousness into a thing, into an objective being. Only through this actual sacrifice could it confirm the self-renunciation, for only in the sacrifice does the deception vanish which lies in the inner recognition, by giving thanks through heart, sentiment, and tongue, a recognition which indeed discards from itself all power of being for itself and ascribes it to a gift from beyond, but which is this very discarding retains its outer stake in the possession it does not give up, but its inner stake in the consciousness of the decision it has itself made, and in the consciousness of its content determined by itself, which it has not exchanged for an alien content, filling it up senselessly. But in the sacrifice actually carried out, just as consciousness has sublated the activity as its own, so in itself its unhappiness has also withdrawn from it. That this withdrawal has happened in itself, however, is however the doing of the other extreme of the syllogism, of the essence being in itself. But the sacrifice of the unessential extreme was at the same time not a one-sided doing, but contained within the doing of the other. For the surrender of its own will is negative only on one side, by its concept or in itself. But it is at the same time positive, vis-a-vis the positing of will as the will of another, and specifically of the will not as a singular will, but as a universal will. For this consciousness, this positive significance of the negatively posited singular will is the will of the other extreme, a will which, just because it is another for consciousness, comes about for it not through itself, but through the third party, the mediator as counselor. Hence, for consciousness, its will does indeed become universal will that is in itself, but to itself consciousness is not simply this in itself. For it, the surrender of its own will as singular is not in its concept the positive aspect of the universal will. Similarly, its surrender of possession and enjoyment has only the same negative significance, and the universal that thereby comes about for it is not for it its own doing. This unity of the objective and being for itself, which is in the concept of activity, and which therefore becomes the essence and object for consciousness, just as this unity is not the concept of its activity, so too it is not given to consciousness that the unity comes about for it as an object, immediately through itself. Instead, it lets the mediating minister express this certainty, itself still broken, the certainty that only in itself is its unhappiness the reverse, vis-a-vis an activity that satisfies itself in the activity or blissful enjoyment, that its impoverished activity likewise is in itself, and the reverse, vis-a-vis an absolute activity, that by the concept activity is only activity at all as activity of the singular, but for consciousness, its self-activity and its actual activity remain an impoverished activity, and its enjoyment remains pain, and the sublation of them in its positive significance remains a beyond. But in this object, in which its doing and being, as the doing and being of this singular consciousness are to it being and doing in themselves, there has come about for consciousness the representation of reason, of the certainty of consciousness that in its singularity, it is absolutely in itself, or all reality. And just like that, we have finished self-consciousness, and we are now moving on to, let's see what we got, CAA, reason. Section 5, certainty and truth of reason. I would say that we're going to do another game of Heroes of the Storm, but I'm about to pee my pants. So, what that means is that I'm going to end the stream here for phenomenology, or for Hegelians of the Storm, and I'm actually going to move over to Bread and Circuses, which is going to be me playing some World of Warcraft. If you'd like to join, then check me out over on Twitch. If you would like to rewatch any of the parts of Heroes of the Storm, or Hegelians of the Storm, that have gone by since, you can always watch those over on my YouTube. It's also Warbling Ox. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you soon. Bye!